Okay, well, thank you for that kind introduction, Marlene. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be associated with this very prestigious and much sought after and very popular art exhibition. And I know I speak on behalf of the art community and I'm sure the broader community throughout Sydney and Australia in thanking you, Marlene, for hosting this exhibition as you do every year. As Marlene said, I'm both an artist and a lecturer, more of the former now than a lecturer. I still teach, but fairly sort of intermittently after 21 years of full-time teaching in universities in various places. It's now a real pleasure to spend much of my time working in the studio. I'm represented with one painting here, but I can also speak with some authority on one other one that happens to be my wife's, which is Fiona Greenhills in the corner. Although I would hasten to add that when she knew I was coming to speak today and to do the floor talk about the paintings, she said, "Not so fast," and just before I left, pushed into my hand a sheet of what I had to say very much exactly about her work. Well, it's a real pleasure, and I'd just like to say a few things about how I would imagine the floor talk will unveil. I will be looking at certain sort of works that are of particular interest to me. Initially, I will talk, well, not initially, but throughout that choice, I will talk about the prize winners, as I think that's a thing that we always sort of attracts us, sometimes confuses us, sometimes just simply reinforces what we knew anyway. And so I will talk about the prize winners. And then I will just choose a certain select number of paintings, to some extent of people that I know for the simple reason that I know a bit more about their working process, and other works that just simply attract me and which provide the opportunity for us to talk more generally about landscape painting. Just a few words. Oh, and the other thing, of course, is the technical aspect. This particular work that I'm showing here is an oil painting, but my own work centres very much around, well, sort of circles around oil painting, watercolour and printmaking. And if there are any questions regarding anything technically here, I'll certainly do the best I can to explain how I think it was done. But just first of all, a few words about kind of landscape painting generally. Landscape painting is really the thing that defines us as a nation. It defines Australian art, it defines Australians as nations, and it does the same throughout the world, which is why it would be very evident if, in this exhibition, if we had, and this would probably start to sound like one of those jokes, but one Australian, one Englishman, one American, and one Scotsman, and one Frenchman, I think it would be very evident to anybody who walked through the door of the kind of the difference and how each painting actually represented not only the country that it came from, but really the very essence of what that country stands for. I think one of the things about the landscape is that we all need it. We all have a kind of a craving for it. It's the one thing that defines us, and it actually demonstrates our connectedness as human beings between the land and ourselves. The landscape has been in evidence really since the beginning of time when people first started to make images. We can look back to antiquity and see in places like Pompeii, Herculano, images of kind of fantasized images of gardens, of landscapes that were painted on the walls in the villas to simply act as kind of windows to the world. That tradition continued really up to from the 8th century onwards, right through the medieval period, with these fantasized images of enclosed gardens, Oriental manuscripts describing these kind of fantasies where the Virgin Mary lived, where Adam and Eve were expelled, and just simply reinforcing that connectedness between the landscape and our needs. I mean, that moved on through the 18th century, the great golden age of landscape painting, of very idealised landscapes. Landscapes that weren't particularly peculiar to many of the people. They were simply working in the landscape. But there was that great age of idealised landscape painting. In the 19th century, the landscape actually started to depict what people did in it. It showed people working in the landscape. It showed people actually taking pleasure from the landscape. It really did reinforce that whole sense of our need for the landscape. During that 19th century, people were becoming more and more urbanised. Their traditional roles as farm labourers and sort of small-holding farmers was replaced with shifts to the factory and to the industrialised age. As a consequence, there was this real need for people to somehow feel this connection back to the landscape. They felt a certain inadequacy by being part of the new urban age. They wanted to get back to nature, which reinforced their feelings of connectedness to God, to the land, to the very essence of what they stood for. And then by the 20th century, we've had this sort of complete redefinition of landscape. And it's really interesting to see how, although it began in the late 19th century with Cézanne, how the landscape has become the very kind of poignant vehicle for the developments in modernism and the radical changes that have occurred in the visual arts throughout the 20th century. Cézanne chose his apples, but he also chose the Mount Sainte-Victoire, his garden, the various fields and the farms around Provence to rechange, to question and to change the whole nature and development of 20th century painting. Similarly, we have Monet, who with his water lilies, his haystacks, painting the same subject over and over again, not only painted some of the most beautiful paintings of the landscape, but really changed and altered the course of 20th century art. By the time it came to the 20th century, we have, as is demonstrated in this exhibition too, a whole variety, an incredibly varied number of different ways of relating to and representing the landscape. If we also consider, we can now move from images in the 20th century as convincing as Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World, painted in 1947, a very literal painting from Northeast America of a woman, simply a paralysed woman sitting in a field, to the kind of conceptual developments that have happened with the landscape, where Richard Long, the British artist who, in arriving in Australia to make art, simply walked in the desert for 2 weeks, leaving a variety of stones laid out in various paths and lines. We really have a very kind of rich history of the national environment, and we must consider too that whereas historically there was the emphasis to paint nature in all its beauty, paint nature in its kind of natural form, that to some extent happened in Australia from 1788 with the early settlers. But we have to remember too, and as is demonstrated in this exhibition so richly well, is that there's also the urban environment. And the urban landscape is very much as part of our lives. Certainly for I think it's 82% of Australians who live in the cities around the coast. The urban situation, the urban environment is very much part of our experiences. That's really good, but we almost so must remember that when we look at the history of Australian art, it isn't just all about the Glovers and the Eugene von Gerards, as wonderful as they were. It's also about the early topographical artists, some of whom were convicts, painting early Sydney and giving us images of its kind of urban development. Sure, it was to send back to Britain to try and persuade them to give more money, and the fact that many of them were done by convicts sort of gives us reason to know that it's no surprise that they were highly exaggerated. But the urban environment, Government House, early Sydney, was painted as early as the turn of the century, as early as sort of 1800 onwards. And that urban situation, the urban depiction rather, has existed ever since. And we've only have to look at paintings throughout the 19th and 20th century, the wonderful Roberts painting of Marvellous Melbourne, all the way through to paintings that we have here, and in particular, I'm looking at the painting, the painting of, you'll have to edit this bit, Robin Sweeney, with the urban painting of the urban house up there. So that's really interesting, and I would just like to sort of really conclude by saying just how important and what a pivotal role the image of the landscape has made to us really since the Heidelberg days, even further back than that we could argue, about our appreciation of landscape and of our kind of necessity and our awareness to conserve the landscape. Now, conservation is a fairly kind of hip word at the moment. It's associated with all sorts of things, including political parties. We tend to associate it with being a very kind of modern concern. In fact, if we look back to the early paintings of von Gerard, who was acutely and astutely aware of the sort of damage that was occurring through settlement, through clearing of timber, etc., and the ramifications and dangers that was having both to the environment and to the animals and the fauna that lived within that environment. This was reinforced by people like Hans Huyssen, even by Streeton's famous painting of Fires On, where a painting that we're all familiar with, one of the most wonderful icons in the art gallery of New South Wales. But we see the kind of devastation of what can happen to the landscape through, in that instance, mining. So we should never really underestimate the importance that good landscape painting has, how much more we respect the landscape as a consequence of those artists, Aboriginal artists like Fred Williams in particular, Boyd's. The list is kind of goes on and on and on. It is these people, really the Huyssens, all of the people in the 20th century, those that have really interpreted and have felt the landscape that have made us appreciate it. Not us just as artists and art lovers, but I think society large. We're very kind of dependent on those kind of images. We need those images, and we really can never underestimate the contribution that I think art can make to the preservation of our landscape. And I really conclude now by just sort of saying these few words, a quote from Streeton and Roberts, two people who, with the Heidelberg School, really gave us what some people like to call our national school of painting. They did to some extent, I think it had gone on before, but what they did leave us with was the colours that our sporting teams still wear. That wonderful sense of the blue, the yellow and the gold. The green, the blue, the green and the gold, which I trust we will see tomorrow night when the Wallabies play the All Blacks in fine form. And what I like about their quotes is that it just leaves such a kind of optimistic, open notion for future generations of artists. Streeton talks about a beautiful Australia, and I want to expand on it, and I want to express it in my own way. I fancy large canvases, all glowing and moving in a happy light, and reinforced by Roberts, who said, "To express it all makes others feel what beauty there is in it. Australia has it all, but it hasn't been fairly touched yet." I think those kind of lines are very optimistic. I think the paintings in this exhibition just reinforce how the landscape, the Australian landscape in particular, is of an inspiration and is of interest to so many artists. And again, I think on behalf of all of us, thank you to Marlene for being aware of that and for providing so many artists with this opportunity to show to the public their interpretation of the Australian landscape. Thank you.